The program you're about to watch is one of a range of practical gardening videos produced by Periwinkle Productions. You'll find details about how to contact us at the end of this tape. Throughout, our aim is for you to watch The Expert and then experience the sheer pleasure of being able to go out into your own garden or greenhouse and do it yourself. From now on, you'll share with others that extra special confidence which these programs provide to create a garden of which you can be truly proud. So, sit back and enjoy yourself.
Hello, I wonder what you'd call this. I wouldn't mind betting the chances are you'd call it a geranium. And not so long ago I'd have said the same. Actually, we were both wrong. These are the true geraniums. They're a hardy herbaceous plant, commonly called the meadow cranespill. So how did this confusion happen? It dates back a long time to when pelargoniums were first found in South Africa and brought back to this country. You see these beak-like seeds of the true geranium? They look a bit like a cranespill and gave the plant its common name. Compare them with the seeds of this species Pelagonium. They're very similar, and the botanists who first found them lumped them together under the name geranium. But they were wrong. They soon realized they couldn't cross them with a native geranium. So in 1789, steps were taken to put the South African plants into a botanical group of their own called Pelagonium. During the 19th century, the name Pelagonium was used more and more. Then, after World War II, a group of nurserymen and amateur gardeners formed a society to forward the development of this group of plants. Unfortunately, they called it the Geranium Society, and this brought the name back into common use. But whatever you call them, they've become firm favourites in our gardens. And here's someone who's a real Pelagonium enthusiast, Anne Swithenbank.
Yes, I find them fascinating. I think they're a marvellous group of plants. And I must have acquired my first geranium when I was only about 10 or 11, I think. So
well, not so very long ago.
Oh, no, not so very long ago.
And you kept up the interest?
Yes, I have. At school, I found myself in charge of the school greenhouse, you know, growing all the plants that we needed for experiments. And we used to get through a tremendous amount of geraniums. We used to use them as guinea pigs for experiments on photosynthesis and things.
Well, that's right, yes, boiling them in alcohol. I remember it myself, yes, dear, oh dear. Any particular favourites of yours?
Yes, I like the dwarfs and miniatures because I think you can fit so many into a collection. And also I like the species, but that's me, isn't it? I like the more unusual sorts of plants.
And you're going to show us some of those?
Yes, I'm going to go and get them ready now.
Jolly good. While Anne gets ready in the greenhouse, let me tell you something about this video. We hope that whether you're a beginner or you've been growing them for years, there'll be something for you. David Clark knows a thing or two about growing pelargoniums. He'll be showing us his methods of propagation, breeding, training and general cultivation. And we meet a couple who 5 years ago came home from a local horticultural show with their first cutting and are now winning prizes for their own exhibits. But first we're going to the greenhouse where Anne has some marvellous species to show you.
This is my favourite Pelagonium species. It's often known as the cactus Pelagonium or Pelagonium echinatum, and it has these very sweet little flowers with 2 maroon dots on the upper petals. And I think it's rather lovely. It flowers in summer but also in the winter as well, so it's valuable winter colour for the greenhouse. And unlike some of the species Pelagoniums, it's got quite a compact shape, but they are quite an unpredictable lot. Sometimes, for no apparent reason, the cactus Pelagonium will drop all its leaves and stop flowering and turn into this, which looks more like a succulent plant. And in fact, you treat it exactly like a succulent, just dry it off a little, and very soon it will start to produce leaves and flowers again. So don't worry if this sort of thing happens. So they're different to some of the modern hybrid Pelagoniums, but quite important in their history, because there are 250 of these species, and 25 of them have given rise to all the Pelagoniums that we grow in our gardens today. And one of the most important of the species, really, is Pelagonium zonale. Now you can see from this why we don't grow them as garden plants today, because it's very ungainly. It would be quite difficult to fit something as wild and unruly as this into your garden. It has quite pretty flowers, but nothing to really write home about. What is important is to notice the patterning on the leaf. You can see this very strong zonal marking. And this species crossed with this species, which is Pelagonium inquinans, has given rise to all the hybrid zonal pelargoniums that we grow and enjoy today. Plants that look very much like this one, with the characteristic zonal marking on the leaf and very pretty, in this case, double flowers. Now, another important couple of Pelagonium species include Pelagonium cuculatum crossed with Pelagonium betulinum. This has an interesting name because betula is the birch, and this Pelagonium has birch-shaped leaves. But those two crossed together have given rise to all the regal pelargoniums, which are very popular as greenhouse plants and look like this, which is a regal hybrid. So, of course, they've given rise to a lot of our plants that give us so much enjoyment. But there are one or two other species that are worth growing. I think I'd bypass a lot of these rather succulent plants. I don't think I'd give this very much house room in my greenhouse. It's not the most beautiful of specimens, but quite interesting if you're interested in unusual plants. This is Denticulatum, a species with quite delicate little bright green leaves. That's rather nice, and very small but pretty little flowers there. They're quite sweet. Rather smelly foliage, not a pleasant smell really when crushed. And this is quite nice too. This is a species called Australe, which for a species has quite chunky flowers and a fairly compact habit of growth. And if you wanted a collection of species pelargoniums in the greenhouse, this might be one to go for. Quite nice fresh foliage as well. But as a group, they're really only interesting as far as the history is concerned. And there are so many good hybrid zonal pelargoniums and others to grow that they're really only for the keen enthusiast.
There are many groups of plants in the Pelagonium family. The largest group is the zonal, and these are often called the zonal geraniums. It includes many subgroups such as the ornamental leaf, the dwarfs and miniatures. Then there are the regals, the early flowering plants with large trumpet-like flowers. The next group is the ivy leaf. It takes its name from its leaf, which is similar to the ivy. The scented group have aromatic leaves. Unique were an early hybrid, and there are not many in this group now. And finally, the angels, which are a cross between the crispum and the regals.
Among zonal pelargoniums, there's a wealth of choice. There's really a plant for everybody here amongst this group. Here's a plain-leafed kind with doubled flowers. There are also plain-leaf kinds with single flowers, and these are for people who like just a straightforward pelargonium. But if you want to be a bit more adventurous, there are some that have the most marvellous leaves. This has gorgeous golden leaves with a rather subtle zonal mark running around it, and lovely flowers that rather complement the colour there, I think. There are other sorts of golden leaf kinds. The one I've just brought in has very bold zonal markings called golden ears. This one has a more rounded leaf and quite bold zonal markings. And this one has almost plain gold leaves where the zonal marking has shrunk to almost nothing. It's very, very pale there in contrast to some of the others. And then there are the ornamental leaf types, which can be very bright and bold. This is a well-known variety called Mrs. H. Cox, which has got at least 3 colours on the leaf there. There's a cream, a green, a sort of maroony reddish colour and pink. So there's really 4 colours on those leaves, which is very beautiful. And here another multicoloured leaf where there's yellow, orange, dark green, green. Beautiful colours again. And here just variegated leaves with 2 different colours of green on the leaf and white going around the edge. And this is a well-known variety called Caroline Schmidt that's been used many, many times in bedding schemes over the country before the seed-raised pelargoniums really came into vogue. I can remember taking thousands and thousands of cuttings of these when I worked for a parks department. So there's a great deal of variation. The plain leaves, the golden leaves, the ornamental leaves, and leaves with really quite unusual patterns and markings on them. This is a stellar variety which has very indented leaves and quite deep zonal markings on this particular variety, which is called Bird Dancer. I love this one. I think it's got the most delicate flowers, and because it's got such striking leaves, I don't think it matters that its flowers are small. I think that rather adds to it, and I think the name Bird Dancer suits it beautifully. There are varieties that have quilled petals. This one has very deep red flowers and quite plain leaves and doesn't really look like a pelargonium at all. It's got nice dark flower stems as well. I think this is a very striking plant. And then there is this one, which is a very old variety that's regaining its popularity. This is a variety called Apple Blossom Rosebud and has the most amazing flowers that really do look rather like apple blossom. It's a very intense double. And even stranger, I think, is a tulip-flowered variety called Patricia Andrea, where the flowers never really fully open and look rather like tulips. And this is actually quite good as a cut flower, and you could use it in flower arrangements. So I do think that there is something here amongst the zonal group that would suit almost anybody. This is a miniature pelargonium called Goblin, and having tried to interest you in growing these zonal pelargoniums of various different sorts and whetted your appetite, I have to say it is a little bit unfair when some of them can get really quite large, and if you want several different sorts, really a representation of all that they've got to offer, then maybe it's difficult to accommodate them in a small greenhouse or even just in the house or a porch. But these really do present a solution, the miniatures and dwarves, because if you look at this ornamental leafed Pelagonium here, that's taking up almost the same space as this entire collection of little miniatures and dwarves, which are very pretty, very varied, and yet there they are. You can put perhaps 4 or 5 on a south-facing or west-facing windowsill. You could have a small area of them on greenhouse staging very, very successfully. They have a completely different habit of growth to the taller growing kinds. If you look at this plant, you can see that there are quite large gaps in between the leaves, and the stem is quite succulent and the leaves large. Now if we look at this 4 or 5-year-old plant of pale pink double Dean Bowler, which is a miniature, you can see that the growth in there is really very dense. It's very dense and shrubby, and the gaps between the leaves are very small. And that's the difference. Within the miniatures there's lots of variation. You could choose from little plants like this urchin, which is really a stellar variety, but in miniature form, with those lovely little crisp, thin petals and pretty leaves. There are doubles, like this Jane Eyre, which is a gorgeous pink colour, very floriferous. I think this one's lovely. It's called Alday and has single flowers, but they contrast so beautifully with the foliage, and they're held up well above it, so it's got quite a different form to something like the Jane Eyre, where the flowers hugged the top of the plant. There are even golden leaf plants, which could be used to bring a little bright patch in amongst the collection of plain green leaf varieties. And this is quite special, Milden, which has speckles and freckles all over the leaves. This is really quite unusual. And stripes as well. So within that group there's enough to keep a collector quite satisfied. So you could just collect miniatures and dwarves and leave all the rest of them alone and still have a fascinating collection of plants. Regals are possibly the showiest of the pelargoniums. They have large, blousy flowers, and often as many as 15 to 1 stem. The modern varieties start flowering at the beginning of summer and will carry on right the way through. And they really are a picture. When they're flowering in full pelt, they're so smothered that you can hardly see any of the foliage down through the flowers. They're quite different in habit to zonal pelargoniums, and you wouldn't plant them out as bedding plants. They really are only for the house as a short-term pot plant, or for the greenhouse or conservatory. They don't like being put outside where they've got to battle against the elements or the wind and the rain. They're really quite hothouse flowers. The flowers are very prone to damage because they're so large and full and frilly. The plants themselves can get quite woody and even straggly, I suppose, after a while. This plant, you can see, has got quite a woody base. It's begun to get quite corky there. And this is obviously an older plant that has been cut back at some time, and new shoots have grown. Younger plants are much more compact. These would be about 1 year old from cuttings. And there is a good variation of flower colour. This one is lavender harewood, a really striking deep colour, lovely colour combination there. And this one is quite unusual in that it has fringed petals, and that's Fringed Aztec. Ivy-leaved pelargoniums have slightly succulent leaves and usually a trailing habit, which makes them very useful for covering the edges of hanging baskets and window boxes. They're a familiar sight on the continent where balcony and cascade varieties are used. These have lots of small single flowers and really tumble out of containers in great froths and cascades of flower. Individually they're quite straggly, but en masse they're absolutely spectacular. And really they're catching on in this country as well now. There are double-flowered types, which are very popular here, but they don't flower with quite such the same profusion. And there are some which have quite long joints and are very long and traily, and there are others which are more compact. For smaller containers, l'Elegante is a very good one. This has variegated foliage and white flowers, and even smaller, more petite, is Sugar Baby, which is so compact it really doesn't trail at all, but has lots of lovely little pink flowers. So all in all, they're a very useful group, and are really very easy to look after as well. Another of my favourite groups, I think I like them all really, are the fragrant types, and planted out in the herb border here, which is a very good place for it, is Pelagonium graveolens with its lovely citrus-scented foliage. This is really easy to grow, but if you confined it to a pot, it wouldn't be quite so large as this, and it wouldn't have such wonderful big leaves. But there is a variegated version of it that's also very attractive to grow, and that's Lady Plymouth. This is a nice compact version of Lady Plymouth, a plant that's been overwintered and then pruned quite hard in the spring and grown on and probably pinched out a little bit as well, so it's stayed nice and rounded and it's got some pretty little flowers on too. This is one that hasn't been pruned back, and you can see that it's really desperately untidy and needs a good trimming. This is what should have happened to it in the spring. It should have been cut back hard. When you prune a pelargonium, you prune just beyond the nodes or the swellings on the stem. And I'd be quite ruthless, cutting always beyond the little shoots that are coming off, and take off some of these old scruffy leaves as well. And that will really sprout on and grow quite well. And all that rubbish has been taken off, and it's, oh, the smell coming up from all those cuts is quite overpowering. I'm not quite sure if it's citrus or whether it's pine or whether it's peppermint. There's a whole variety of odours coming up out of that plant. But one of the most lemon-scented plants, I think, is Mabel Grey. I've never met another plant that had a more intense lemon fragrance than this. Not in flower at the moment, but you've only got to just brush it and the smell is so strong. Now, this plant was pruned hard in the spring. And with these scented leaf types, you don't need to keep propagating them and growing fresh young plants. It's quite a good idea to let them build up and become old. Pop them on once every couple of years or so. Sometimes you don't need a larger pot, you can just pop them back into the same one and trim the roots a bit. And just keep pruning them. That's the secret of keeping them nice and compact and sturdy. This one is Old Spice, and that's got a very, very spicy smell to it. That's quite exciting to smell, quite different from some of the lemon-scented types. Altogether, a very good and interesting group to grow. There is a small group of pelargoniums known as uniques. Not very many people grow them now, although 150 years ago they were very popular. And the reason for that is probably because although their small heads of flower are quite pretty, and again rather reminiscent of species, there isn't a tremendous amount of flower to the amount of leaf you get. And also the plants tend to be rather large and ungainly, and you have to do quite a lot of repropagating and pruning to keep them under control. But they do have quite nice aromatic foliage. This one is Peyton's unique, with these rather nice pinky, sort of glowing, warm-coloured flowers. I grow Scarlet Unique, sometimes bedding it out with other pelargoniums around the garden, sometimes just growing a couple of potfuls in the greenhouse and just taking a few of these rather nice scarlet flowers off as cut flower to use in the house. If you find that regals are a little bit blousy for your tastes, then you might prefer angel pelargoniums. These have a more shrubby habit. They're more delicate in appearance. I like them because they remind me very much of the species that I like. The flowers are smaller and the leaves are smaller, and you can actually pick individual flowers out against the background of the foliage. I think possibly Catford Bell is the best known. Certainly I grow it, and quite a lot of people in my family grow it, which is possibly not surprising since we all pass cuttings round amongst each other. It is very pretty, and the secret of success is to keep the young plants well pinched back so that they stay bushy and don't get too long and leggy. Now, possibly because this group do tend to have smaller leaves and flowers, they seem to me to be a little bit more rainproof, and I do risk planting them out in the garden and using them for containers. But I have to say, I haven't got a window box as fine as this. This actually belongs to David and Elaine, who are going to be meeting later, and this won them first prize at their local horticultural show. And it really is very, very excellent.
All these wonderful flowers in so many different colours and form. Very nice, you might say, but how do we grow them? Easy. Ask a professional how he does it. David Clark has won 10 Chelsea Gold medals for his pelargoniums and fuchsias, and what better qualification can you get than that? Let's join him at his nursery.
At Oakley Nurseries, we propagate pelargoniums every month of the year. However, amateur growers normally propagate plants in the late spring or late summer because that's the time they root most easily. The general method for taking pelargonium cuttings is virtually the same for all the different groups. Now, on this zonal pelargonium plant, I'm going to take the cutting by cutting just above a node. This is important. Cutting number one. I'll take another one from the back. Two. Now, the reason I cut just above a node is because if you cut below a node, it leaves a snag on the plant like this, and that invariably will rot. Sometimes, like it has here, the rot will stop when it reaches the node, but sometimes it doesn't. If you're taking cuttings in the winter, it's always a good idea to just dab a little flowers of sulphur or even petroleum jelly over the cut surface to seal it off. Regal pelargonium cuttings are taken in exactly the same manner. Cutting carefully with a sharp knife just above a node. Cutting number one, I'll take another one here. Now notice I emphasised take the cutting with a sharp knife. Some people prefer to just break the cuttings off. This is quite possible. In fact, you can break a cutting off a bedding plant, insert it in the garden, buy it in midsummer, and the plant will root, no problem. But you try doing that in the winter and you'll probably end up with rotting cuttings. Ivy leaf pelargoniums taken exactly the same manner. Cutting just above a node. Those are the three main groups. But of course, pelargoniums come in ranges of sizes, miniature and dwarf. This is a dwarf pelargonium. Cuttings are taken exactly the same way, but because the plants are smaller, the cuttings are slightly smaller. One. Two. Similarly from the wide range of other types of pelargoniums, angel pelargoniums, scented leaf pelargoniums, take off the cutting, severing just above a node. And lastly, a species or near species. This one is called Pelagonium tricolour. I'll just take one cutting from that. Now, before the cuttings can be planted, they've got to be cleaned up. This zonal pelargonium cutting must have all the lower leaves removed, together with the leaf stipules. These are the little pieces of leaf just where the stem joins the main plant. Take off all the leaves, just leaving those partially developed leaves near the top. And finally, the cutting should be trimmed just below a node. There. That's ready for insertion. Similarly with the regal pelargoniums. Never take all the leaves off, just leave a little cluster like that. That's about right. And remove these leaf stipules. And any of the growths that are too low down on the cutting to be of use. And similarly, trim just below the leaf joint. Ivy leaf pelargoniums, again, remove the leaf stipules, lower leaves, and if there are any flower buds, remove those as well at this stage. Finally, trimming below the leaf node. Right, now we come to the dwarf pelargonium. As you can see, the cuttings are that much smaller. The exact size doesn't matter too much, but make sure it's more than an inch long. Cuttings that are less than an inch long are less likely to root. And this Pelagonium crispum, very nice scented leaf variety. Just clean up the lower leaves. Clean off the lower leaves. Any little bits of material low down on the stem that might rot. Trim neatly to just below a node. And there we are, that's ready. Similarly with Pelagonium tricolour. There we are, it should be about right. This one is so short jointed it's almost below a node anyway. There we are, that's fine. Now, before we plant the cuttings, some of them must be dipped in hormone rooting powder. Now, there's a bit of controversy about this. I would prefer never to use hormone rooting powder for zonal pelargoniums or ivy leaf pelargoniums. Now, the reason for this is that if you use hormone rooting powder, it causes the end of the stem to swell. And when it swells, it cracks. And if it cracks, it seems to let fungus in and the whole plant rots. It's usually at the stage where you get a beautiful rooted cutting, plant it up, and then it collapses and dies. So I would not use hormone rooting powder on ivy leaf pelargoniums or zonal pelargoniums. But you'll find that regal pelargoniums and some of the other groups are much more difficult to root. They take longer. And in fact, it's essential to use hormone rooting powder on regal pelargoniums, particularly in the winter. You'll find that many of them won't root without it. As for the dwarf and miniature pelargoniums, I would normally not use hormone rooting powder. But if the stem has gone slightly hard or woody, sometimes just a little bit of hormone rooting on powder on the end will make all the difference. But be warned and be careful with the way of using it. Right, hormone rooting powder for regal pelargoniums. Dip it in well, tap the surplus off. That's ready for planting. And with these types, the Pelagonium tricolour, Pelagonium crispum. And these I would not normally use hormone rooting powder. These I'll use hormone rooting powder for. Now we're ready to plant up the cuttings. Now the type of compost which is used is important. You must use either a seedling compost or one which is specially designed for rooting cuttings. You can buy them in the ordinary nursery or garden centre, and their use will be marked on the bag. Don't use one which is specifically for potting plants, and definitely don't use garden soil or any other unsterilised compost. Cuttings are simply inserted into the soil at such a depth that they'll stand up happily on their own. Just firm them in slightly. That's all that's required. Zonal Pelagonium cutting in a similar manner. They can either be inserted in individual pots or you can plant several in a little tray. Ivy leaf Pelagonium. There. Right, they're now ready for watering in. Now, I prefer, when watering in, to use not just plain water, but water with a little fungicide in. It can either be liquid copper or something like benlate, made up at the usual strength for spraying. Water them in fairly well. Now, the cuttings should be put in a warm place, something like 60, 65 degrees Fahrenheit is ideal. They shouldn't be in direct sunlight, but they need good light. So on the south side of a greenhouse with a sheet of newspaper in front of them is ideal. They don't need any sort of covering. They're best left in the open in an airy condition. Zonal Pelagoniums will root in about 10 to 14 days. Ivy leaf Pelagoniums in a similar sort of time, but regal Pelagoniums and some of the species will take longer. They can take up to 30 days or more to root, particularly in winter. That's all there is to it.
I know that people have trouble with their Pelagonium cuttings because a lot of them ask me where they've gone wrong. And some are confused because they think that they should leave the cutting out to dry before they insert it. What do you think about that?
Well, that used to be the advice in the older books and so on, but these days it isn't practiced, certainly not commercially. You just take the cuttings, prepare them and insert them straight away.
And how do you know when they've rooted and you can actually pot them up?
Yeah, that can be a problem, but with a little experience you can actually see it. Before they've rooted, the plants take on a rather grey, bluey grey appearance and look rather sorry for themselves. But as soon as they've rooted, they become more shiny and the leaves are turgid, they're stiff and they're paler in colour. And of course if you use this sort of peat pot, you can actually see the roots appearing on the side of the pot, so you're certain then. And of course they do grow. If you see fresh growth, they must be rooted. Grafting is quite an advanced procedure, and I wouldn't recommend trying it until you've been growing Pelagoniums for a year or two and are happy with their general culture. Now, the main reason we graft plants at Oakley is to produce standards. Although it's possible to train many Pelagoniums on their own roots in exactly the same way as you'd train a fuchsia, it's almost impossible to grow a tall regal Pelagonium standard that way. Before grafting can take place, the grafting stock has to be grown. This alone can take the whole of the summer season, so growing a large standard can take 2 to 3 years. This is the stock which I've selected, and I'm going to graft on top of it a regal Pelagonium, a nice bushy one. Now, the selection of the type of stock for each particular plant is important. I always use Caroline Schmidt for zonals and ivy leaf Pelagoniums, but any other strong growing zonal Pelagonium will do. But for regal Pelagoniums, I prefer to use one of the scented types, or in this case, I've chosen a unique. Growing the stock is fairly simple. Take a cutting in the normal manner, grow it on, but remove all the side shoots so you get a single stem, and as it grows, tie it to a suitable cane. Now, before preparing the stock, I'm going to prepare the scion, the bit that I'm going to graft on top. Here I've chosen regal Pelagonium fringed azek. The cutting, or the scion, is prepared almost like a cutting. taking off any of the surplus leaves and side shoots. And leaf stipules, just as if you were preparing a cutting. Right. But now the difference comes. What I've got to do is to prepare the cutting so that it has a V-shaped end, and this will be inserted into a similar V-shaped end on the stock. This one's a little tough. You do need a very sharp blade to do this. Right. Now I'm not quite happy with the shape of that, so I'm going to trim it again. You can have several goes at this. That's a bit better. There. Yes, I think that's okay. I'll just remove that little snag from the end. That isn't wanted. Now it's important not to let that surface dry in between preparing it and inserting it into the stock. So to prevent it from drying, I'm going to just rest it in a little bowl of water. Now, preparation of the stock. I'm going to graft just about here. The actual point of making the graft isn't important, but the stem here should be still fairly soft and pliable. Once it starts to go brown, it's too hard to make a good graft, and it will probably fail. Cut across, straight across the top. That part isn't wanted. Now I must prepare a V-shaped notch in here, which will roughly match the one I've prepared on the scion, on the regal Pelagonium. There. And that piece has come out. I now have a nice V-shaped notch in the stock. Now the two parts should be placed together, like so. With any luck, that will almost hold itself there, while I get a piece of twine to tightly bind the two together. And when I say tightly bind the two together, I do mean surprisingly tight. You've got to mould the two surfaces together. You can see I'm putting quite a lot of pressure there. Winding that round and back down again. Make a single little knot. There. Now, while that union is taking place, this will tend to wilt. So to protect it from wilting too much, it's a good idea just to place a polythene bag temporarily over the top, like that. Leaving plenty of air in there, leave that fairly loose, and just draw the bottom of the bag in with another piece of twine. Right. Now, that whole plant should be put in a bright place, but not in direct sunshine, as this little tent here will get absolutely red hot if you leave it in the sun. Leave the bag on for about 10 days, then loosen this tie at the bottom, but don't take the bag off, just let a little air get in. And after another 5 days, that can be removed completely. And gradually the plant can be accustomed back into full light. After a while, about up to 30 days, the tie can be taken off. Just unwind it. And providing the graft has taken, the plant will continue to grow normally. Remove any side shoots as they form from the stock, and support it well with a cane. It'll take another year, perhaps, to get a nice big head, but then you'll end up with a beautiful standard Pelagonium. And this is a 2.5-year-old specimen of fringed Aztec. It's grafted onto a stock of one of the uniques. Potting is a straightforward, almost mundane procedure, but for best results the operation has to be carried out in the right way at the right time. First of all, I'm going to pot up a newly rooted cutting, growing nicely, roots showing through the sides of the pot. With this type of peat pot, I always like to break some of it away, being careful not to damage too much of the root system, but just enabling the new roots to come through a little more easily. Little soil in the bottom of the pot, plant in, fresh compost around. Now the compost for pelargoniums should be free draining, but apart from that they're not at all fussy. Any of the proprietary potting composts based on peat, the peat substitutes or Johnny Needs compost is fine for them. They're not really that fussy. Label back in, little tap to settle the plant, and that's the first one potted. Now I've got an established plant that's been grown on from a rooted cutting. Now that at this stage needs to go on into a larger pot. Carefully remove the old pot, and you can see the root system is filling the pot, and that's just at a nice stage to be potted on. Don't let it get too root bound, otherwise the plant will be checked. Need a fair bit of compost in the bottom of this. Place that in the middle. Fill in with compost. Tap it down, move it around a little. Now notice I'm not going to firm it down very much, just light firming with the fingers. That's all that's necessary, and even then I like to tap the sides of the pot to make sure it's settled evenly. Now it doesn't matter whether you use plastic pots or whether you use clay pots. Use whichever you prefer, you can get good results with either. Now as I'm growing this plant on, I'm going to do something which to some people seems a little controversial. I'm going to pinch out the growing tips by just breaking them off gently near the top. Here's another one, like that. Now that will have the effect of making the lower branches grow. The plant will become more bushy, and ultimately it'll be a very much better shaped specimen. And as I'm really wanting to put on growth rather than get flowers at the moment, I'm going to remove these flower buds. Looks drastic, but that plant will be improved. That's that one finished. Now here I've got an established plant which is about a year old. It's probably filled the compost with roots, and all the nutrient from that compost has been removed, and it will have been sustained by feeding. But every year, usually in the spring, it's a good idea to give every plant a change of soil. Again, carefully take it out of its pot. There you can see the old established root system. I'm going to carefully tease away some of this old compost. There's the label. Just squeeze it gently like that and shake. This is one of the peat-based composts, one of the soilless composts. It does have the advantage of breaking away fairly cleanly. There. Now we've exposed the root system. Put the old compost on one side. If the old pot is dirty, by all means give it a good clean before you reuse it. Little fresh compost in the bottom of the pot, but before you put too much in, put in the old root system. And if it looks dead in places, don't be afraid to trim it off. I'll put that in and gradually work in some of the new compost around it, shaking to make sure that it works its way in between the old roots. You can do this at any time of the year, but generally at the start of the growing season is the best time to do it. Depending on how warm you keep your greenhouse, any time, February to March is the usual time. But also, of course, if you're growing show plants, you'll have to be dictated by the date of the show. Right, that's settled in nicely. Now, because this is an old plant, it'll probably need shaping. you can see that this is growing more on one side than the other. This is because this has been facing the light. To get a more uniform plant, it's always better to rotate them, perhaps a quarter of a turn every week, or a half a turn every fortnight. It doesn't really matter. But at this stage, it's a good idea to trim the plant back. I'm just taking pieces off just to really shape the plant. That's it. I think you can see what I'm doing. What I'm trying to do is to create a much more attractive ball shape. It's much more symmetrical than it was before. That will produce lots of fresh growth and there'll be little problem with that. But on the other hand, if you've already got a plant which has gone a bit too far, like this one, it looks a bit straggly, don't be afraid to trim it back quite hard. There, there. That looks drastic, but that will produce new shoots from where these leaves are, remembering to trim fairly close, just above a node.
What about general cultivation, David? Watering, for instance?
Yes, there's, of course, a couple of schools of thought there. Some people like to water from below, some prefer to water on top. But the whole purpose of it is to evenly water the whole soil. So as long as you provide enough to soak up to the top or down to the bottom, you achieve the same results.
How do you determine when it needs watering again once a certain amount of drying out has taken place?
Yes, well, the easiest way is to look at the surface of the soil. It should certainly look dry. Most soils go very much paler when they need watering. And if the plant is wilting slightly, so much the better. Remember that pelargoniums come from a dry region and do prefer dryness. Ivy leaf pelargoniums need the least water. Zonal pelargoniums need a little more, and regal pelargoniums need almost ordinary pot plant treatment.
And what happens if you've let a plant dry out so that it's completely dry and all the leaves are wilting? What do you do?
Well, usually when that happens, you'll find the soil, certainly with a peat-based compost, has shrunk and left a gap round the side of the pot. So all you can do there is to water it, let that soak in, and an hour later water it again, to make sure that the soil ball is thoroughly watered.
And how do you feed the plants? What sort of feeds do you use and how often during summer, that sort of thing?
Yeah, there is a slight difference in requirement between zonal pelargoniums and regal pelargoniums. Regal pelargoniums require lots of potash. If you use something like a tomato fertiliser, that's fine for them. The ratio of potash to nitrogen should be about 2 to 1, say 20% potash, 10% nitrogen, something like that, that's fine. They can be fed that all the year round. If you feed that to zonal pelargoniums, they'll do okay, but very often you'll find the edges of the leaves going a bit pale and they may even take on a reddish tinge. They do need a little more nitrogen, something about equal amounts of nitrogen and potash. How to apply it? Well, the easiest way I find is to dissolve a soluble fertiliser in the feeding water and apply it that way. I do that about once every 5th watering. So if you're watering every day, you're feeding every 5 days. In winter, if you're watering perhaps only once a month, well, you're hardly feeding at all. That would be once every 5 months. In other words, don't bother to feed during the winter. It really depends how much water you give them, how much you ought to feed them.
Of course, winter care is a totally different thing, isn't it? Because most of us will be overwintering our cuttings or young plants and our stock plants at very low temperatures. What sort of guidance can you give for them?
Yes, well, during the winter months, you need to keep frost away. And if you can keep 45 or even 50 degrees Fahrenheit as a minimum temperature, and I mean a minimum temperature, use a maximum minimum thermometer to make sure of that, so much the better. And if you can use electrical heating, which keeps a dry air, that's vastly better than using something like a paraffin heater. For every gallon of paraffin you burn, you get slightly more than a gallon of water.
What about ventilating during winter?
Yes, if you can get the ventilators open during the winter on a mild day, so much the better. And particularly during the winter, you must be very careful about picking off leaves as they start to decay and die. If you leave them on, a rotting leaf can rot the stem. It's really something you ought to do every weekend.
I have to say that I let my pelargoniums go right down almost to freezing. I can get away with 37
But
to
you
40
obviously keep them pretty
Fahrenheit.
dry.
Very dry,
Yes,
very
yes.
dry. And quite well ventilated as well.
Yes, we've kept them, or found that they've survived in an unheated greenhouse in a
Yeah.
mild winter. But because we were neglecting them, they didn't get watered at all. And they
Because that's not
survived.
ideal, but you
Oh,
can
no,
get away with it if
you
you
can
have
get away
to.
with it,
Yeah.
yes, yeah. The commonest way to produce new hybrids is by cross-pollination. That means fertilising one plant with the pollen from another, different plant. Don't try to be too ambitious at first, and only cross members of the same group together. To pollinate a flower successfully, it's necessary to apply ripe pollen to a receptive stigma. You can tell when the stigma is receptive because initially the lobes are closed, but they unfurl when they're ready to take the pollen. The anthers are brownish and smooth at first, and the ripe pollen can be seen quite clearly by its powdery appearance. I'm going to use this plant of Rossmoroi as a mother plant, and this plant of Hazel Gypsy as the father plant, the pollen donator. The process is fairly simple. The ripe pollen from the father plant has to be placed on the ripe stigma, which is here. Because this plant also contains pollen sacs, I must first remove those to prevent any chance of cross-fertilisation. So I'll snip those off carefully using a pair of pointed scissors. There. Now it's just a matter of taking another flower. In fact, I'll cut this off, folding the petals back, and using the pollen to pollinate the stigma. Make sure plenty of pollen touches it. There we are, that should do the job. It's necessary to pollinate quite a few flowers because it's not always successful, particularly with these modern varieties of regal pelargoniums. Now, of course, bees will fly around and would also do their own pollination. So to prevent them from pollinating it with pollen from another flower and upsetting our plans, it's necessary to just put something over the flower to stop the insects getting in. Here I've used a piece of muslin. It doesn't have to be muslin, but it should be something which the air can move through. Don't use something like plastic, otherwise the flowers will just rot. Just close that up slightly with a bit of twine. Leave that on for a few days, and after that the stigma will be mature and the bees can't cross-pollinate it. Take the muslin off as soon as possible and allow the seeds to ripen. I'll just remove this so I can show you what I mean. Once the petals have fallen off, you'll end up with something like this, with green seed pods. Although I've never timed it, it takes about 6 to 8 weeks for these to ripen during the summer. And when the seeds are ripe, you'll see little silvery tails appear like that on the side of the seed pod. That's the time you harvest them.
If you go out to buy seeds, you're often astonished by how few there are in a packet. I'm going to finish the sowing off in here, but these have done very well. These little seedlings they were sown about just over a month ago. But of course you need very high temperatures, don't you, to succeed with them?
Yes, you need 70 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit constant.
And that would mean either putting them in a heated propagating case
Preferably.
or, once you've sown the seed to put the pot inside a plastic bag and then into the airing cupboard. But my goodness, you'd have to watch it every day, wouldn't you?
Oh yes, they can germinate quite quickly. Particularly commercial seed has been often scarified. That is, the seed coat has been reduced in thickness, so they can emerge within 12 hours.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what happens to these when I manage to get them out of the packet. There's only 6 seeds in here, and I'm going to have to be very careful with them. But sowing them into a little pot like this, you just push the seed very delicately so it just goes under the surface of that seed compost. It mustn't be buried too deeply, must it?
No.
And then watered in and put to germinate. 6 seeds in one packet, and the packet could be costing between £2 and £3.
Yes.
Why?
Well, it's F1 hybrid seed, and that is expensive because to produce them, you've got to have 2 separate lines, and each of those lines must be breeding true. So to make them do that, you have to cross them with themselves for a minimum of 7 generations, which usually means 7 years. And then at the end of that, you cross those 2 lines together to get your F1 hybrid. And of course, the plants that you get might not be what you want. You have to start all over again. But even if they are, these plants have to be hand-pollinated. And so naturally, it makes the whole thing very expensive, I'm afraid.
But once you have raised your seedlings, which can cost between anything between 50p and £1 each, you can presumably then continue them by cutting from year to year.
Cutting is just like any other plant.
So it can be quite a good investment. And you don't have to pay a fortune for seeds from a seed merchant, or you can get F2s and...
Yes, open pollinated ones at a much lower price, yes.
And presumably collect your own seed as
yes,
well.
you can. I mean, I've been collecting some here. This is the way it comes when it's freshly collected from the plant. It looks rather different from the seed that you've just sown. But the thing is, it's got a little corkscrew tail on it. In the wild, this would drop down onto the ground, and depending whether it was dry or wet, or a fluctuation between the two, this little curly tail opens or straightens and concertinas up again. And this has the action of actually driving the seed into the soil. But the seed that we actually sow, the seed that we got in the packet, is inside this little piece here. I'll just try and remove it. It's a bit tricky, actually. There we are. There, that's the seed that you got in your packet. That's the part that you sow.
No matter how good you are at looking after your plants, you can't really help what sort of horrible pests and diseases come in through your vents or on plants that come in and start attacking them. So what can you do about it?
Yes, I'm afraid everybody's going to get some pests and diseases. You just can't get away from it. Although pelargoniums are pretty resistant to most things, they all have their Achilles heel. I suppose with regal pelargoniums, we've got to talk about whitefly first, because whitefly do like regal pelargoniums and fuchsias. Unfortunately, it's a pest that has become resistant to many of the chemicals that's in currently use, and that applies not only to the amateur but to the commercial grower as well. I'd recommend using something like pyrethrum initially. This is a natural insecticide obtained from a sort of chrysanthemum, been used widely for many years and very, very low toxicity to man. If that doesn't work, use something like this, which contains permethrin. That is a synthetic material, but it's based on pyrethrum. It's a synthetic analogue of it, and that should still work. But these insecticides only kill the adult fly, so it's a good idea every now and again to give the plant a good wash with something like this, a good washing up liquid. Just put a good squirt in a bucket of water and swirl the plant in it. This has the effect of decreasing the eggs and the juvenile stages and helping to kill those as well.
When you are applying sprays to kill whitefly, how important is it to keep repeating the spray?
You have to follow the directions on the packet. Usually you'll have to apply it 2 or 3 times. And if you see that a pest is coming, treat it straight away. An established outbreak of any pest is far more difficult to deal with than if you catch it early and nip it in the bud.
So what about red spider mite? That's another bad glasshouse
That's another
pest.
problem. Most groups of pelargoniums don't suffer too badly, but I found fairly recently that ivy leaf pelargoniums do suffer from this. A lot of outbreaks of what is thought to be oedema, the little sort of brown corky patches on the underside of the leaves, are in fact caused by red spider mite. There's not much you can really do about that, apart from making sure the plants are growing well, growing strongly, and treating them perhaps with one of the general purpose insecticides.
And what about aphids? Do they attack young shoots?
Yes,
mostly?
they will attack young shoots of most of the pelargoniums. Usually they're pretty resistant to it, but there are some quite good and safe insecticides. Those based on pyrimicarb are particularly good because they don't affect bees and other pollinating insects. Otherwise, malathion or many of the other killers can be used. Even the soapy water treatment, again, it's well known that this is effective.
And sciarid flies, these little nasty, well, not nasty particularly, but little black flies that fly around the surface of the compost.
Yes.
Oh, they irritate a lot of people, don't
Yes. Of course, the flies themselves are harmless. It's their little grubs that live in the soil which cause all the damage. They will eat rotting material. That's normally what they live on. But unfortunately, they do sometimes attack small plants like seedlings. You find that perhaps your precious, expensive pelargonium seedlings will be felled almost as if something's toppled them over and the roots have gone. This is almost certainly Sierra fly. The best thing you can do with those is water the soil with a solution of malathion or sprinkle a little gamma BHC dust over the surface. This will get rid of them, and it only affects the young seedlings.
Sometimes I think that putting a layer of vermiculite over the surface might help because the
Yes.
adult fly then doesn't want to lay its egg into this sort of
That's
rather
probably
alien
the best way
substance.
to deter things rather than
Yes,
actually, you know,
yes.
reach for the chemicals. I agree.
What about vine weevil? That's the scourge of a lot of people.
Dear, yes, this causes no end of headaches. Here at the nursery we are fortunate, we've never seen it in 20 years, but some people seem to be plagued with it. It's caused by a beetle which flies into the greenhouse. It lives outside, the vine weevil, flies into the greenhouse in the autumn and looks for somewhere to lay its eggs. It lays the eggs in
You
flower
said
pots.
flying. The
Yeah.
females actually can't fly. Is it the males that fly in?
Well, I was under the impression the female flew in because they
Oh.
obviously must have some means of transport to get around and lay them in people's pots.
Right, we'll have to
But
find an
anyway.
entomologist to settle the argument, won't we?
Anyway, they
Yeah.
get into the greenhouse
they
and
get
lay
in.
them in the pots.
Yes.
And the grubs emerge and start nibbling at the roots of plants in the spring. So in other words, if you suspect vine weevil, it can be characterised by the fact that not all your plants are affected because they don't lay the eggs in every single plant. It usually means you have a crop of plants, most of which are doing well, but some, for inexplicable reasons, seem to be wilting. Something's eating their roots. And of course the other thing is that those plants must have been round in the autumn. You won't find it on plants that have been purely propagated in the spring. They can't possibly have vine weevil because they weren't there when the vine weevil was laying its eggs. And it is a very, very difficult pest to kill. All you can do is sprinkle a little gamma BHC dust on the soil, which helps to deter them. Otherwise, it's a matter of unpotting the plant and trying to pick out the grubs if you can find them. But it is a great problem. We haven't seen the real solution to that one yet.
I think that covers most of the main pests. There is western flower thrip, which is a sort of recent pest,
Yes,
isn't
it's
it?
very new. Again, that's characterised by the fact that it chews at the growing tips and makes the plants distorted or actually go blind.
So do you see it? Can you see this pest?
You
at all?
can see it. It's a small brownish insect, very small, scuttling around, but it's most easily identified by the symptoms, as I said, of blindness and distortion of the leaf tips.
And is there anything one can do by way of spraying to control it?
You can try one of the general purpose insecticides, but they're not terribly effective against this. There are new things on the way. And also, if you can get them, the blue sticky traps. You know, you can buy the yellow ones,
Yes.
which trap white fly and so on. You can buy these from garden centres. You can obtain blue ones, which were much more effective.
Oh, Oh, they prefer blue, do
They
they?
prefer blue,
Oh,
but
that's
unfortunately most
interesting.
garden centres don't seem to stock them. But they
No,
are
I've only
available
seen
to
the yellow
commercial
ones.
growers. Yes, yes. This is another alternative to using chemicals for those who don't want them.
In my own greenhouse, I sometimes suffer from, well, I don't, but my pelargoniums do, from a little caterpillar that rolls itself up in the leaf.
Yes, 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 caterpillars can be quite a problem, but they're fairly easily cured by the same sort of chemical that will kill whitefly, namely permethrin. You spray those over the plants in the autumn. Usually one spray is pretty effective in getting rid of caterpillars. The only other alternative is to go around with your fingers. And,
Yes.
yeah.
If you're not
very
too
popular.
squeamish.
Yes.
We haven't mentioned biological control at all, but of course it is there. It's
Oh,
a whole
yes.
subject in its
Yeah.
own. If you choose not to use chemicals, then you can go into using biological control.
These are
I
available,
do
yeah.
use quite a lot of that. But of course I have to reintroduce it at the beginning of every season before the pests build up to great proportions.
Yes.
And I always have to tolerate a small amount of the pest
Yeah,
there.
I think you always
throughout.
have to tolerate it. It will never eliminate the pest. We've tried using it commercially, but if a customer finds one whitefly on one of our plants, it probably isn't good enough. So we
That's
have to use
right.
other means as well.
Yes, but there is even biological control now for vine weevil, although
Oh
it is
yes,
quite expensive.
yes, quite expensive. Yes, and I think the secret with using that is you've always got to make sure that you anticipate the problem. If you get a big outbreak, if you introduce the predator, it could never catch up.
No.
No.
What about the various diseases they can get? Surely rust must be one of the worst.
Yes, Pelagonium rust. It only affects zonal pelargoniums, of course. Ivy leaf and regal pelargoniums don't get it. It only affects the zonals. It's characterised by little yellow spots on the upper surface of the leaf and a corresponding circle, a raised circle of gingery brown spores on the underside. It's very infectious. The best thing you can do is, when you see it, pick off the infective leaves and spray the plants every 7 days for several months with something like Dithane 945 or Murphy tumble blight.
What about if you have a clean collection of plants and somebody gives you a pelargonium? Should you quarantine it in
It's
case?
a good idea, yes, if you have got somewhere where you can keep it, and you need to keep it really for a whole season.
Really?
Yes,
That long?
because sometimes the rust will stay in an inactive state on the leaf. It needs something like 5 hours of a continuous water film on the surface before that spore will germinate.
So what about other diseases they can suffer from?
Yes, apart from rust, I suppose one of the other things that causes a lot of problem, these little cauliflower-like growths that appear at the base of zonal pelargoniums. This is in fact not really a disease of plants. It's caused by a bacterium that lives in the soil. And when a shoot appears from below soil level, the bacterium attacks it and turns it into this rather peculiar knobbly cauliflower growth.
I've seen that, especially on miniatures and dwarfs.
That's right, they're particularly
Yes.
prone to it because they're usually very short jointed, so they have more growths that come from below soil than the others. All you can do is to pick those knobbly growths off, and when the plant stops producing shoots from round the base, the problem stops.
Can you if you take cuttings,
It's
can
fine.
it doesn't
'Cause
travel
it
up?
doesn't actually enter the plant. It's a disease of the soil. Obviously, if you touch the soil and then touch the next plant, you are transmitting it. And it also can be transmitted in water and even wind-blown soil. So it's a problem you'll always get from time to time.
Are there any rots or nasties they can get?
Yes, blackroot rot of pelargoniums is quite common. There's a bit of controversy about this, not probably on my part, because I find that if a pelargonium dies at the roots for almost any reason, it turns black. It's usually a fungus, as is said to call it, the species of Pythium that attracts the plant. But I've had plants which have rotted at the roots and turned black. I sent them for analysis, and they could find virtually no fungal or any other pathogen there. It was purely, when I had the soil analysed, far too much nitrogen in it was killing the plant. And as it died, it turns black. So very often these fungal diseases are a secondary infection, not the main cause of the problem. But if you get that, obviously, you've got to look at it, repot the plant, keep it away from the others, and don't take cuttings from it. You can't treat it.
So a lot of this disease prevention is really a balance of common sense and good cultivation,
It is
I should
really,
think.
yes, yes. The other problem, of course, which you get all the time is grey mould, botrytis. usually occurs in the autumn months when you can't open the ventilators and the air is still. If you use an electrical heater, particularly a fan heater to keep the air moving, that helps to reduce it. But any decaying leaves or decaying parts of the plant should be removed immediately. That's the only way you can really control that. Or an occasional spray with something like benlate, which is a pretty good fungicide for that sort of thing, and for mildews.
I think that can be aggravated in a very small greenhouse that's absolutely encased in bubble plastic to try and keep the heat in.
Undoubtedly.
You've got to let some air in somewhere, haven't you?
Oh, yes. The only other thing which causes a problem, of course, is oedema on ivy leaf pelargoniums. This is the sort of little brown, corky, raised patches on the underside of the leaf. And this is said to be caused by irregular watering, letting the plants go dry and then giving them a big sudden watering. And these cells are supposed to burst. And this could be the cause of the problem, but I feel it's also associated with mineral deficiencies as well, because if you repot the plant, give it fresh soil, it usually disappears. And also red spider damage can look very much like oedema. And of course, with all these chemicals, if you don't like wet spraying, there's also smokes as well. You know, of these little smoke cones, either insecticides or fungicides. Although they're more expensive, it's a quick and easy way of doing it.
Of all the popular garden plants, the Pelagonium is one of the most versatile. Their range of colours, types and forms makes them the ideal choice for use in so many ways, from brilliant displays in public parks to the more modest, colourful plantings in containers and hanging baskets in our own gardens.
What a lovely sight, a summer hanging basket full of trailing ivy leaf pelargoniums. And I like to see all the same variety growing in one basket. I think it looks better and I think the plants grow better as well because they're not all competing with each other with different habits of growth. There would have been 5 plants put in there in the spring and it will be in full growth by full summer. So how do you make a lovely hanging basket like that? Well, this one has been lined with polythene with holes made in it, which is both economical and quite practical because it will hold a good amount of water and dry out less quickly than some other methods of basket lining. Moss does dry out a little bit quickly, especially if it's only a thin layer, but it looks so good, especially when the plants are establishing themselves. So that's what I've chosen for this basket. Now, it's very important to use moist moss. So this has been soaking overnight in a black plastic bag, and if I take out a handful, I can squeeze quite a lot of water out of it. And I've been putting a decent layer of moss all around the inside of the basket. What I feel is very important is to get a good solid rim, which helps hold the compost in. What I do is I just push the moist moss around the rim and tuck it in. And I'll keep doing that all the way around, pushing it over the top and tucking it in and squeezing hard. And when that dries, it will make a lovely solid rim there, and it won't get washed away when you water it, and it will hold quite a lot of water in the top of the basket so that when it gets dry and you water it, there'll be space there for it to sink in. So squeeze around and tuck in. And when I finish the basket, I'll cut off all the excess moss with a pair of scissors, and then I can use it to reline the next basket. Squeeze and tuck in like that. And if there's too much inside and you think it's a waste of moss, then just pull some of it out and use it for the next one. Right, it's done that. A sensible precaution to stop too much drying out is to just lay a circle of black polythene in the base, and you needn't put holes in that because that's just going to hold a little bit of extra moisture and the excess can escape through the moss around the sides. And the next thing is to put the compost in and then the plants. Now there's a lot of choice of composts as well. Peat-based composts are very popular, they're light and easy to use, but because of environmental reasons some people have decided not to use peat and have gone over to using one of the peat alternatives. This is a coir or coconut fibre based compost, which is fine to use as long as you observe 2 important points about it. First, it is not peat, so it won't behave exactly like peat. so that when you use it, if it appears to go dry on the surface, just stick your finger in when you're getting used to the watering, and you'll often find that although it appears to be dry, it's actually still wet underneath. So there is a danger of overwatering it if you're not careful. The second important thing about it is that it does need more feeding, and you need to start feeding sooner than if you were using a peat-based compost. But providing you remember that, I think that grows plants really well. And the third main group of composts are loam-based composts, which in most cases is John Innes, which you can go and buy already mixed. This is very good, of course, for growing a wide range of plants, but it does have one disadvantage for hanging baskets, in that it's very heavy. But by all means use it if you think you've got a nice strong chain to hold all that weight when it's wet. I'm going to use a peat-based compost this time and put a couple of handfuls in the base to start me off. And again, this should be moist. If you open a bag and it's dry, or you've had a bag that's been open for some time and it's dried, then just moisten it before you start. I've set the plants in so that they'll all be at the correct height when the basket is finished, and that's very important. Even if it means playing around with the plants a little bit at first, they shouldn't be so high that their roots are sticking out, and they shouldn't be so low that they're going to be buried by a significant amount of compost on top of the root balls. And I've also left a bit of a gap at the back, and I've marked the back with a label, and that's because if the hanging basket is going against a wall, it's rather silly to put a trailing plant coming right over the edge, especially one with quite a spreading, succulent leafed nature like this, because you really don't need it there. It won't get the light, and it will actually start to grow into the wall. So use all your plants for the front and for the middle. And I will get 5 in here, and I'm just going to fill gently down between the root balls of the plants that have just come out of their pots, and also around the edges, just pressing very lightly and making sure that the compost level is just below the rim, of course, so that I can get water in the top. It's not a good idea to mound your basket up. It might look quite good, but it's not practical when it comes to watering. I've planted these the traditional way, but there is another way of planting these pelargoniums, which might be easier for an amateur. If you take out a little bit of soil so that you can actually plant the pot with its plant inside, you have to make sure that there is enough compost to go around the side so it's quite firmly planted. And you would do this with all of them, of course, getting them in the correct positions quite carefully. Then all you have to do is just slide that pot out very gently, leaving a mould behind. Take the plant out of its pot, nice root ball there, and it should fit like a glove. That's it. And then just a little bit of compost to go over the top, just a scattering to cover those roots on the surface. And that just needs watering in and should settle in very well and can be hung up. I like to use pelargoniums in window boxes mixed up with other plants, especially the foliage types, because they actually make the flowers stand out more. The pink flowers of the petunia and the flowers of the cascade pelargonium here stand out better for being surrounded by scented leaf pelargoniums, the odoratissimum for instance, and the very distinctive leaf of chocolate peppermint. Some pelargoniums make good container plants, and the scented leafed kinds mix well with herbs. So I'm going to plant a nice aromatic herb container using a terracotta pot. And I've chosen one that's going to be in scale with the plants. It's fairly low and wide because none of the herbs or the pelargoniums are going to be that tall. And the important thing is to get the drainage right. There's quite a large hole in the bottom of this terracotta pot, and we don't want all the compost falling out the bottom, so the first thing to do is put crocks over that hole. And then to improve the drainage over the whole base, I'm going to put some expanded clay pebbles in the bottom as well. Not everybody has unlimited access to broken clay pots these days. And the next thing to do is add a little bit of compost, and this time I'm using coir. I haven't a great deal of experience of using the coir fibre composts, the coconut fibre composts in containers, but now is as good a time as any to find out. And I think providing I feed well, it should be absolutely fine. Pelargonium fragrans has lovely pine-scented foliage and pretty little white flowers, and because that's going to be the tallest plant, it can go in the middle. I'm going to use 2 and push them close together to grow as one plant so that the pot will have an instant effect. You could just use 1 and wait for it to grow, but I'm a bit impatient. So just loosen the compost of both of them and push them together. so that they'll grow as one plant, making sure they're at the correct height so they won't be higher than the rim of the pot. Now they look nice and bushy in the middle, and the herbs can go around the outside. This is a variegated sage, and of course that could grow quite large, but the whole idea of this is to use it for cooking. So all these plants, including the pelargonium, where we'll just be taking the odd leaf, will be used continuously. So the idea is that you keep the sage and the marjoram and some of the other herbs down in height by continuously cropping them. Put the marjoram there, and I'm going to put a few thymes around the front, both gold and silver, on the basis that probably this container will be stood against something, so the thymes are going to hopefully flop all over the front and cover it up rather nicely. So I'll put a gold, a silver, and then a gold. And it will just be a case of filling in around the plants, giving it a good water in, and standing it in a nice sunny spot, because all these herbs, including the pelargonium, will like the sunshine. And all those nice fragrant leaves are going to pour over the front of the container. But it is important to use them. There's no point planting a herb container and just leaving it, because they get very straggly. The more you use them, the better the container will be. The thyme and the marjoram are quite hardy, but the pelargonium will probably die off over the winter unless it's brought inside. So it might be a good idea to just lift that out for the winter, bring it inside for overwintering in frost-free temperatures, on a bright windowsill where it can be cut back, or in a greenhouse, a frost-free greenhouse. Don't worry too much about all the compost going over the edge, because that will come off when it's watered in. But it is important to leave a generous margin for watering, otherwise if it does get dry you'll have an awful job getting them re-moistened. There we are. Let's tidy it up as much as possible. Quite a pretty little container with lovely soft colours.
And now I'd like you to meet Elaine and David Cherry in their lovely Hampshire garden. They're both keen gardeners, but a few years ago David had a serious back operation that meant he was unable to do any heavy work. One day, after visiting a local horticultural show, they came home with a cutting. It was the beginning of a new way of life for them.
We went to a local society show and I persuaded David to join the society. That was 5 years ago, and we now enter the shows. This is our 4th summer that we've entered shows. We're still very much beginners, but we enjoy it.
My interest in fuchsias and pelargoniums started after I had a back problem, and I had to retire from work and got into greenhouse growing.
We bought a greenhouse and we used to share it, and Dave used to have one side and I had the other. We used to work back to back. The only thing is I'm organised and I like everything in alphabetical order, but David likes everything higgledy-piggledy. And it just didn't work. And then we used to accuse one another of watering one another's plants, and if a plant died we blamed one another. So we then had the opportunity of buying a second-hand greenhouse, a small one, so David had that one. And but then decided that he was too tall and too big for the small greenhouse. So we then bought him a big one of his own.
This is my propagating table that I made, an open propagator. I bought 5 by an inch timber, made a square verge of it, bought a soil cable, 1.5 inches of sand, laid the cable across, 1 inch of sand again on top of that, added a thermostat so that I can set it at the required temperature, leave it and not have to worry. And this is a few of the cuttings that I've raised. And over here I have my angels, which are a miniature regal in actual fact. I have half a dozen different varieties, And then on this side, I keep all my zonals. Miniatures on the top shelf. Dead petals away, or else they turn to botrytis. On this bench I used to have capillary matting, but I found it made the air around the plants too humid, so I've gone to using saucers, and I water from the bottom, which I find suits the plants a lot better.
As you can see, I prefer to grow the fuchsias. The greenhouse needs to be different to the Pelagonium house. You need more humidity. So on the bench I have a thing called hydrolica, which absorbs water and keeps a nice humid atmosphere around the plants. I've grown a plant called Excalibur. It's for a fun section in the local show, and I've actually grown the plant in a piece of tufa rock. It's been in there about 3 months, and I've stuck a sword in the back so that it depicts the actual name of the plant. This year at the Fuchsia Society show I got my first and won a cup, and it was for the small pot culture class, and I've grown a fuchsia called Auntie Jinx in a flower sieve. It has to be grown in a 6-inch hanging pot, and they're not obtainable, so you have to use a flower sieve. In the early part of the year, very often in the evenings on the television there's not much to interest us. So we've been known to be sat down there at 11 o'clock at night with the neon light on, looking at the plants, cataloguing the plants, looking for cutting material ready for the spring. I think our neighbours think we're crackers.
It's not winning that matters, although it's nice to get prizes. I think you get enjoyment out of people actually looking at your plants and getting pleasure from them.
Well, Harry, here's proof that you really can use pelargoniums for cookery. A lemon cake made, or rather flavoured, with the leaves of Pelagonium crispum variegatum.
And it's strong enough to do that?
Yes, yes, you put them in with the flour, and the flour takes up the flavour of the leaves.
And crystallised leaves on the top
They're
there.
very pretty, aren't they?
Yeah.
Would you like a piece?
I'd love a piece. Well, have fun with your pelargoniums, and for once we can really say a flower that caters for all tastes. From all of us, bye for now. A piece of cake, isn't it? For the beginner and expert alike, the colourful catalogues sent out by specialist Pelagonium nurseries offer the widest choice of plants. Oakley Nursery's catalogue offers fuchsias and pelargoniums and contains some beautiful photographs taken by David Clark himself. The catalogue from the Vernham Geranium Nursery also provides a good read, with hints on growing and general cultivation and some useful addresses for the pelargonium enthusiast. There are many splendid colour plates of all the varieties to help you with your choice of plants. Pearl Sulman specialises in miniature and dwarf pelargoniums, and plants can be bought by mail order. The addresses of these nurseries and details of how to obtain the catalogues are given inside the video sleeve.
below the wood and it's the size of anything.